Shane, welcome and thank you for presenting today.
No problem.
I think everybody knows you that's online, so I will pass it over to you straight away. And just checking that you can share the screen and everything okay?
Yeah, so how do I do this in terms of presenting? Do I upload onto this, or what's the
No,
best
you can
way?
just share your screen.
Okay, 1 second.
Yeah.
Perfect. I go back here. So
fantastic.
Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Looks good.
Yeah, move this over here. All right, sorry for the scary imagery. So the shadow is meant to represent data, because we often think of the actual product, which would be the hand. So we can think of in terms of problematizing data problems as sort of like the shadow in the background, lurking in the background. Yeah, so today's talk is problematizing the normal neat boundaries of the ethical data governance for data intensive software systems. And I'll get to what the reason for that title is in a moment. I'll just go through quickly in terms of background, where I'm coming at in terms of work I've previously done on ethics. If I go back, sorry. So I've previously been working over the past 2 years and over the past year with Empower on issues around ethics, more to do with previously was more to do with education and training. So in that respect, we published a little bit on professional bodies of knowledge and issues around IT professional bodies of knowledge and how they actually cover the topic of ethics in them. We're also interested in issues around, this is myself and Dr. Claire Torney, who's a collaborator of mine on ethical issues. The other project we were interested in was around knowledge extraction and education when it comes to science fiction as a way to both learn about or extract new forms of knowledge from science fiction, but then also as a really engaging way to talk and communicate knowledge about science fiction. So these are the publications that we previously worked on. And the last one, I guess, is relevant for the current project on data governance, because I've previously published on issues around governance itself. These are some examples of IT bodies of knowledge, and you can see how we started to explore how ethics was included in different aspects. We looked at different themes. If I can move this theme across. Themes and ethics covered in these documents include things like ethical theories and teaching, diversity, inclusion, limits of knowledge, which is interesting in terms of being an ethical issue where people don't have the required knowledge or have lack of knowledge around a topic. So it's kind of where responsibility lies. It's kind of, well, I don't know the answer, so I can't take responsibility. And that being an ethical conundrum itself. So responsibility and consequences, issues around power and inferred trust. So how say technology or data can grant power to people and take power away from others. So knowledge being power, I suppose, would be another aspect of that. The second, that was the bodies of knowledge piece of work we worked on. The second piece was on science fiction, and we looked at different landmark works or classics from past century, stretching from 1932 to 2013. And we were interested in trying to extract, well, what are the knowledge themes around ethics that these books deal with? And what we we were interested at the time in ICTs more generally, not specifically on data. What we found was that there tends to be more of a focus on technology, whereas the larger literature on technology and ethics tends to focus very much on technology. These books focus much more on knowledge itself, and especially on issues around human embodied knowledge and issues around technology taking away humans' ability to big picture think or having holistic knowledge, like limiting or reducing their creative and critical thinking abilities. And that was sort of a concern that we recognized outside the normal neat boundaries of what people normally consider ethical issues around technology. For this project, for what I've been doing with Empower for the past 12 months, I've been looking at the landscape of data governance and what the literature on that is, and then trying to reduce that down to carve out specific research projects out of that. That began with a systematic review of the literature, identifying how does existing studies treat the topic of ethical data governance, and how is it distributed. And as you can see, theorists like Luciana Floridi would be kind of one of the main sort of influencers in how we think about ethics, and how it stretches, especially in medicine and the social sciences. It tends to be treated quite a lot. Example publications. So out of that systematic literature review, I suppose one thing I should start with this conversation, well, what is ethical data governance? So firstly, what is data governance? So there are a bunch of definitions in the literature. Some of these are kind of, I feel, quite comprehensive. So I mean, first one is, it's about allocation of authority and control over data and the exercise of such authority through decision making in data related matters. Another one is organizations and their personnel defining, applying, and monitoring the patterns of rules and authorities for directing the proper functioning of and ensuring the accountability for the entire life cycle of data and algorithms within and across organizations. And the one I particularly think captures pretty much everything, especially in a more pragmatic way, is data governance concerns the organizing logic for the structures, the policies, the processes, the technology, the people, and the activities in place regarding the sources, the lineage, and the usage of data, algorithms, and software. And what you can see there is I've started to include in data governance also algorithms and software, because I'll get to that a bit more in a minute, why that's the case. So this is about ethical data governance. So then what is ethics? So ethics is a set of values and principles concerning the behaviors, the conduct, and the outcomes of actors. And those actors could be organizations, they could be peoples, or they could be artifacts. Examples of values can include things like fairness, transparency, freedom, privacy, sustainability, accountability. Examples of principles could be removal of bias, opt-in features or functions on, say, a website, or consent needed to share data. And then what's really important is there are three different approaches, fundamental approaches to how we think about ethics. And the first one would be virtue. Virtue ethics would be a set of sort of principles that people try to live their lives by. Deontological would be a set of rules that are enforceable and put in place, or that are very directive about how you should do things, whereas virtues are a bit more broad. So I'll give you an example of virtues, so it'll help contextualize why virtues is a bit broader. And consequential then is kind of thinking the means and the end. So thinking in terms of outcomes, and thinking about ethics in terms of what are the ultimate outcomes of what you're doing, rather than thinking about necessarily how you do things. And often, to talk quite frankly, you need to think about all three. So you need to think about how you do things, the way you do things, but then also what are the consequences, rather than just saying I'm going to do things in a good way, so I don't need to think about the consequences, or I should only think about the consequences and not how I do things. Because there can be ethical conundrums or damages or harms done along the way, as well as the outcomes. So examples of virtue ethics would be things like honesty, self-control, humility, justice, courage, empathy, care, civility, flexibility, perspectives, and so forth. And then thinking about ethical governance or ethical data governance, you also need to start to think of it both internally to the organization, including employees. You need to think of it externally in terms of, say, the customers or the landscape, the society, inter-organizational in terms of sharing data between organizations. And then ethics can also then within and outside, or internal or external to the organization, can be thought of in terms of at an individual level. So what's ethically good for the individual might be necessarily ethically good for the community, and vice versa. So ethics can also be thought about from a community point of view, from a group point of view, from an individual point of view, or even a societal point of view. And those don't necessarily always align. So talking about, to go back to the third definition of data governance, I mentioned that I tend to prefer to think about data governance in terms of both data, algorithms, and software, because algorithms and data and software, it's very hard to disentangle the three and treat them separately. And the literature often tends to treat these topics separately, but as everybody knows, algorithms are the outcomes of data. And so people say AI is as good as the data that feeds it. And then software is often even designed in a way that's informed by data, and often reflects then the affordances and what functions it has and how it's used through data. So it's hard to kind of disentangle the three, and it's not necessarily a good idea. So some of the general findings from the systematic literature review that I carried out were that holistic organizational approaches are urgently needed. So the examination of the whole ethical practice or ethical behaviors of organizations is needed, and how that translates then into the products and services offered, their value propositions. And that, so for example, the ethics of data algorithms and practices are obviously intertwined, as Flirty and Tarido say, and ethically minded conceptual models that marry data practice, algorithms, and software development and use are lacking. Ethics should not be treated as a subset of data governance, but as the lens with which to interrogate and inform data governance. So often ethics is sort of plugged into data governance, sort of like a subsection of how you think about things. Whereas actually you should start with data governance and then interrogate from an ethical point of view what data governance should look like. So it almost should be external or interrogation of data governance, or at least try to do both. And then within all the literature, there are so many different ways to think about data governance from many different perspectives, from say a policy point of view, from starting from say the organization values, the missions, the strategy, the values of an organization. And some websites or some platforms, those values might be quite clear. For example, the famous one, Google is not evil, and I think they no longer use that anymore. But it's a set of values that sort of guide company behavior, and some companies are better at this than others. A set of policies within the organization, things like normative organizing logic of governing data and algorithms and software. Then the practices, the type of data, the algorithm practices, the data sources, the data patterns, how data is treated, essentially, the causation recognition, so how data is treated, the resources, what's available, so the tools, the guides, the timeline, the time, and the people. And I suppose what's really important there is thinking about, well, organizations often allocate people or resources, guidelines, training to software developers or to people working in an organization in order to deal with ethical issues. But depending on how much time they allocate and how much people they allocate, actually translating that into good outcomes is then altered or impacted. So it's not about allocating time or people, it's allocating the right amount of time and people. Competencies in terms of different sort of bodies of knowledge, but also different training and tools and guidelines available. Employee characteristics, whether they have intrinsic motivations, what can be done in terms of how to improve intrinsic motivations to behave and practice the work with an ethical mind. Responsibilities and how those are allocated, so people's roles and their accountability. Structural conditions, organization of responsibilities and competencies, so how the organization has structured itself and how responsibilities and competencies are aligned within the organization. Things like available training, curricula, education activities, principles, so things like specific codes of conduct of ethics, and procedures. So whether, say, the software development team has an ethical deliberation process in place or ethics by design process. So tools and technologies, things like decision to support tools, whether there are incentives or rewards, for example, rewards to identify ethical issues, sanctions, whether there are penalties and exposure for employees that don't report ethical problems or are part of or complicit in ethical problems, the monitoring practices in place, auditing, compliance, and overall then if we go right the way down and you look at it, it really becomes a picture of what is the organizational culture around ethics. So I suppose the point there is data ethics is a big topic, and it can be looked at as all the pieces need to be in place in a jigsaw in order to kind of treat ethics properly. So there are some approaches to governing governing data in place or data governance in place, from say a planning control perspective, from an organizational point of view, from a risk-based point of view. And these are kind of part of the solution, but as I mentioned, not all of the solution. There are example governance frameworks in place for thinking just in terms of the data lifecycle. And there are example approaches to how you go about dealing with data from a planning, implementation, assessment, monitoring, auditing, and compliance point of view. But I suppose I won't go through all of these findings, but I suppose the main thing I want to stress is that a lot of the existing work is very data focused. Although there's some acknowledgement that we need to start to think about the algorithms and the software as well, so the artifact overall, that being more transparent with customer citizens is the most valued. Whereas if you start to become more transparent, then at least the customer knows if they're purchasing this product, it's evil, or the company is not a very ethical company. So as long as it's transparent to the customer, that they understand what they're getting with this product or service, then it becomes a customer choice. But when that transparency isn't there, it's these consequences become unknown to them. For example, with Facebook, it's through publicity and it's through news articles that we've come to learn about the problems with Facebook in terms of their advertising model, whereby nudging and bias is kind of internal to the system. And especially with nudging, it's part of their business model, because the more they can keep you on the website, the more they can advertise to you, because it's principally advertising model of revenue. And so if Facebook is more transparent with its customers about how they make money and what practices they're being influenced by on the site, customers maybe have a better sort of decision-making process to make about how they use the site. Ethical things like deliberation are being increasingly flavored. There seems to be a lack of theory in a lot of the issues around data governance. And I talked about one example, Florides On Life, in terms of how you conceptualize the human being living in a modern world of technology, and then starting from there, how you conceptualize what's ethically right or wrong. So starting from some sort of theoretical framework seems to be absent in a lot of cases. Overall, it's difficult to operationalize approaches into good practice, and ethical treatment is dependent or should align to target groups. So these are, again, some findings. There's quite a lot, and I'm going to skip the rest of them and sort of move to, example roles, things like chief information officer, ethics committees, ethicists, data champion stewards, risk assessment, different processes, ethics auditing, things like all of these kind of approaches that can be put in place that I previously mentioned, codes of conduct that you can see there, risks and harms. So I'll get to risks and harms in terms of, a lot of the literature tends to focus on data governance and ethical issues to data governance as an issue around things like bias and consent. But actually, if you start to drill down, there's a lot more to be talked about in terms of data, and that's just even focusing on data in terms of like the restricted amounts of data that companies has access to, and how that impacts so that the value proposition or what's being offered to customers in terms of the influence that it has on the customers, that would have different influence if it was better data, if the data was better informed. Erroneous data and how that impacts inconsistent data, inappropriate data. So data being used to inform a solution for customers, but in the wrong context. So the critical issue of it being context dependent. The data having as a result an influence, and I talked about nudging and say Facebook as an example, exacerbating existing problems through more of the same data. So data algorithms not being trained with enough data or new data, confusing. I'm starting to, I suppose, get into more of the issues around artifacts rather than the data itself. So whether the product or service is confusing, whether it's I suppose a prominent issue would be, say, on Facebook, a lot of mixed messages, a lot of fake news and all of this kind of thing. So bad data involved. Exploit, whether it leads to individuals being exploited in some degree or their data being exploited. Violate, whether it actually violates the individual and their rights. And I suppose that somehow goes back to consent, but it's more to do with harms. So the goal, I suppose, in the typical sense, is achieving optimal quality, proper use and value gained from data. Things like fair, accountable and transparent algorithms, sustained data quality, delineating sensitive from non-sensitive data, and all of these different aspects. But I want to start to move then to what the topic of the talk is. So how I'll start that is just mentioning, when I mentioned about values, I'm starting to get into a different approach to how we think about the organization. So You might have heard of the idea of goods dominant logic and then service dominant logic. Well, there's another one, and it's called customer dominant logic. And sort of from that trajectory from goods dominant logic to service dominant logic to customer dominant logic, by the time we get to customer dominant logic, we're placing a whole emphasis not just on the customer and their use of the service, but on the customer's whole situation or context themselves. So we start to get interested in data about the customer's lives that extend beyond their use of the product or the service. And that's really what customer dominant logic kind of at its heart is trying to get. So it's perspective on business and marketing based on the primacy of the customer, and adopted in this view means shifting the focus from how systems and providers involve customers in their processes to how the customers and the ecosystems engage different types of providers. So it's thinking in terms of an ecosystem perspective, and it's thinking in terms of a more holistic perspective on the customer. So that becomes interesting or important when you start to think about the harms on the individual as a result of bad data governance or unethical data governance practices, or what that means. And it starts to shift the focus maybe more to the service of the product, so more to the artifact as well, because it's thinking about the whole customer then and how it's impacted. And then I suppose to stretch further, similar to customer dominant logic, I have this idea of value dominant logic, which is kind of focusing on how by understanding the more holistic case of the customer, you can start to think of how an organization can align their values according to what the customer's whole situation is. So then you can start to think perhaps value dominant logic. So then you start to think about, well, how do we start to identify what our values are that align to our customers' whole sort of ethos? And then how do we not just align with our customer, but how do we only connect with other ecosystem players that align to those values? So that was something I was interested in before, but it fits into what I'm going to talk about shortly. The other perspective that's relevant to what I'm about to talk about is adaptive policy. So adaptive policy is this idea that you start to learn from what's happening on the ground, so the impact of, say, an artifact, and data collect from your customers in an ongoing way to iteratively improve policy. So you're seeing what works. It's kind of an experimentation process. You're seeing what works, what doesn't work, and you're continually updating policy and thinking in a more dynamic way, in a less static way. And out of what we talked about so far, some of the possible useful artifacts that could be produced. So the topic of today's talk, let me just check the time because you're already thinking I've gone way over. But this is a short part. So problematizing the normal neat boundaries. What I mean by that is I'm interested in the gaps in the prevalent data governance aspects, such as focusing around policies, codes of ethics, that are not actually addressing the actual impact of data's use on people and society. So thinking again about the holistic impact of people and society. And I suppose I use these two kind of big examples here, the 10 Commandments, because the 10 Commandments is sort of a good example of a well-known, what's the word? Is it deontological ethics? Yes, deontological ethics. So kind of code-based ethics. So there's these 10 commandments: you shall not kill, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And these are written in stone. And these are kind of a very famous example of how to live ethically in a very deontological approach or way. The second example, but what's interesting is they're in stone, so they're unchangeable, they're permanent, and they can't be changed. They're very sort of matter of fact. The second interesting case is, say, the nuclear bomb. And nuclear bomb is a good example of a debate that's happening for 60, 70 years, and especially in the 40s when nuclear fission was developed, whether the scientists who developed nuclear fission should have continued their work when they understood the consequences of what it could do. And they, of course, will say that, and rightly so, that nuclear fission can be used for good or for bad. So it powers, for example, our power plants, it gives us energy, powers our homes, but it can be used for bad. It can be used for nuclear bombs. So I suppose it's kind of it gets more into the consequential approach of ethics. So if I go here, and then to sort of, I mentioned around the lack of sort of theoretical approaches to thinking about ethics. One interesting philosopher would be Bernard Stiegler, and he talks about the constitutive transcendental horizon of the human has been technicality, and which emerges the conditions of possibility of time, society, and culture. So from his point of view, how humans see and relate and understand the world is technical, or it's framed through a technical understanding through history, and that when we design new technological systems, we're also designing the sort of humans that we are and will become. So we frame our world through technology, and then we live through the consequences. We are adding to the archive that will afford future generations their possibilities for being, and also simultaneously framing the way our human past will be recalled and remembered. So it's moving away from thinking just about data governance to thinking more of data within the bigger enterprise of the technology and the technique. And then, of the problematizing the 10 Commandments. It's an example of deontological ethics. It's one of the problems would say thou shalt not kill. So if you're a Ukrainian soldier, that's kind of an ethical problem. Well, it's like, maybe I shall not kill, but at the same time, I've got this ethical conundrum because I'm being invaded and I want to protect my country. Or thou shalt not covet, which basically is saying I shall not have desire or love, only under certain circumstances. So that's basically creating this ethical tension in the individual itself. With the nuclear bomb, I think I kind of talked about that. It can be used for protection or domination. It can be based on powering and making people's lives better through powering their homes, or it can be used for annihilation. And I suppose the other aspect of thinking about the nuclear bomb as a good example would be about how it's activated based on good data. So bad data, it could be sent to annihilate another country. So it relies on good data as to whether it should be or should not be activated. But overall, what I'm trying to get at is there needs to be, while a lot of the literature focuses on data, we need to start thinking about the artifact, and maybe then when we start thinking about the artifact, the technique, the technology, and how it's impacting the individual, then we can start to work backwards. So we can start from the harms of the artifact, and then we can work back from, say, the data. So if you think of the data as being the nuclear fission, then the nuclear fission can be applied for good or for bad. It can be applied to power homes or to power a nuclear bomb. And so data becomes good or bad, not because it's sensitive or not sensitive. Data becomes good or bad depending on how it's applied. And to further that, what I'm trying to say is it's thinking about this data, its application in artifact development and its customer use. It's focused more on harms. It's considering data as complicit, not necessarily as being good or bad in terms of its what it is itself, whether it's taken through consent. It's more about use. It's also considering the companion effects of different technologies and different data, whereas data might seem innocuous or harmless on its own when it's used with something else, or different technologies are brought together. The effects of data then become compounded, and it's also thinking in terms of transparency, consent. So the question I have for the group, and I'll kind of come back to this in a second, is how a focus on the artifact's use recasts or informs the ethics of data governance. And just to give you examples to start the conversation, if you actually look at the literature on technology and ethics, and if you get at it from a more theoretical point of view, you can kind of uncover all of these different concepts that don't necessarily get to, say, data bias or data influence. It gets to more fundamental issues around human life and around society, things like speed, and how things like human flourishing, things like function creep, things like compromising human thinking, mediating how we see reality, the ripple effects and the wider ramifications of the artifact on society. And why I raised all of these concepts is you can start to then identify what are all the sort of the themes around technological harms, and then how do you have semi-prompting questions, or actually a guideline of set of questions for, say, developers, that they can actually answer these questions and say, I'm developing this artifact that uses this data. What are the different possible consequences or harms that can emerge out of this? And that's maybe where I'm going with this project. But I want to kind of ask the group in terms of how you think a focus on the artifacts use recasts or informs the ethics of data governance. And so we can start the chat.
Thanks, Shane, very much. We
Okay.
are gone a bit over though. We usually wrap up at 2, guys.
Okay.
So I know everyone probably is run to the meeting. So I'm not sure if you want to have like anyone want to have a quick answer to Shane's question, or it can be something that we can take offline anyway and follow up with, because Shane, very interesting. So thank you very much. I will leave it open there for anyone for a minute for a question, and then I understand people need to drop off, so I'll leave it there. Rayhan looks eager.
I just wanted to kind of have this chat around, like, if the artifact-based approach is used, so we are kind of assuming that data governance or data just exists to support that artifact, or that's derived.
Oh no, to correct you there, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a data focused approach. I'm saying it needs to be complemented. So I'm saying if we only focus on the data and we don't focus on the artifact, then we're missing a big piece of what the harms of this of data can do. If you consider that data can be used for good or bad, then you really also need to think about the artifacts, not just about the data.
Yeah, like I agree with that. I think we have to contextualize this more in terms of where would this apply, and in those circumstances and where it doesn't apply, kind of a thing. So that's my only kind of worry about it. If we take it as an overarching approach, that there would be many instances where this cannot be applied.
Yeah, so I think that's where I kind of what it's led me to is thinking about in terms of, like, if you have a bunch of prompting questions that kind of get at more fundamental issues around the artifact's impact, then that could guide how we kind of have a checklist, say for software developers, that can kind of go, well, what are the possible outcomes of this or harms of this in terms of the ripple effect that it might have on other people other than the people who use it? What impact might it have on how they see or understand the world? Like, but specific questions that would need to be designed.
Yeah.
So it would just be a complementary approach to, say, some of the software, the ethical deliberation process in software development that's not necessarily there at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. I have to leave now as well.
No problem. Okay.
Yeah, bye.
Lovely. Okay, guys. I think we might have to leave it there. Shane, thanks so much.
Sorry for going over.
That's okay. We see. I know we have them to a half an hour. What we do is it gives time for more questions. I think that's what Marcus would like, questions, so he'll, I'm sure, have some for you.
Okay. Yeah.
So
I can always pick this back up again anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much.
No problem.
And our next our webinar next week, actually, guys, we have no coffee talk next week, but our webinar on digital construction will take place at 3 o'clock next Thursday. So hope you can join, and the invite and links are in your calendars. I hope to see you all there. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Shane.